this is a national initiative then to better understand e-scooters and to make a decision nationally about how they fit into our transport policy and legislation. And we saw the opportunity in Salford to work with TFGM and Lime to gather an evidence base really on how scooters are being used in Salford, who's using them, what for, what issues they're finding, what contribution they're making to mobility, all those questions, and also looking at a kind of wider impact on e-scooters, of e-scooters rather. It's one of the few university studies going on. I know that colleagues in Bristol are also colleagues at University of Western England are also looking at the situation in Bristol. So we're really keen to contribute to this evidence base and provide our kind of insights into, what the future might be for micromobility, these small electric vehicles and bike share and such things, and how these fit into our transport policies going forward. The trial itself has been going on for pretty much 2 years to the day in Salford. And you can see here the map. This is what we call the geofence, the green area. So this is the area within which the e-scooters operate. So within that area, you can use the Lime app to unlock an e-scooter and then pay per minute to use one. Outside the area, they don't work, and it's not legal to ride them. So it's only part of this national trial. But what you can see is that the area is growing substantially from the initial phase at the University of Salford out to Media City, and then to cover a much larger area of Salford that includes more major employers, including the hospital, Media City, and more transport interchanges. So there's much more scope to be using the e-scooters as part of general transport practices. And of course, it's worth mentioning that over this time, society has changed quite a lot as well. In that initial period, we were still in a form of lockdown. People weren't travelling much, and a lot of mobility was kind of recreational, or just sort of people, doing their daily exercise. And then since then, society has opened up again, and we've returned to some element of normality with people going to work, although perhaps not as often to the office. But we've certainly seen that people are travelling more now. So this is a perfect time really to take stock, to look at who's using e-scooters now that people have got used to them being around and had a chance to think about how they fit into their transport practices. So our research, and I know that Lime are going to talk more about their own data next, but our research is very much social research. It's based on talking to people, doing interviews, reference groups, and online surveys. So we're getting a sense of what people think and how they're experiencing e-scooters and other transport. It's an iterative process over 3 stages with 13 reference groups, 3 surveys, and 49 interviews. And over those 3 stages, then you can kind of build up a picture with the findings from each stage feeding into the next. Our kind of starting point, and one I think has been confirmed through the research, is that it's important to consider e-scooters in the context of all the rest of the transport available, the wider mobility offer. And the reason for this really is that people tend to think of that kind of, how does the transport system help me get around? And what we wanted to understand was, what do e-scooters bring to this? What do they add? And I think, from speaking to people, we found out that people see these a little bit like cycling, but not with the same level of exertion, not the same level of activity, but these kind of small vehicles that you can store in your home, carry around. And you have this flexibility also of a kind of share scheme. So there's kind of connection with cycling to an extent, but also people are making the connections with public transport, using them to access public transport, or using them to, in some cases, replace public transport, or sometimes taxi and Uber journeys, which I'll come back to. People are always also making the connections with the impact of other transport, for example, by saying they see these as a cleaner form of transport if they want to choose something that's less likely to contribute to air pollution. And some of the challenges, such as pavement parking, which there's been a lot of talk about in the media, linked with other transport modes as well, because the challenge of sharing space, it's across all transport modes, and something like pavement park is an example where there's this tension on how we use space in order that people can move around freely. We also wanted to not look at Lime e-scooters in isolation. We wanted to look at them alongside privately owned e-scooters. Now, privately owned e-scooters are illegal to use in the UK, but the point of these trials really is to find out and make decisions about e-scooters as a whole. And we spoke to people about private e-scooter use because we wanted to understand how these related. And in many ways, they're similar. They're both e-scooters. They're a similar kind of riding experience. Some of those advantages, like being able to weave through traffic without the kind of exertion of cycling. But on the other hand, a shared e-scooter has the advantage of not needing to store it in your home, not needing to have the initial capital outlay. Private e-scooters, on the other hand, aren't constrained by a geofence, and you can buy one outright and not have to pay per minute. So there's different kind of advantages and disadvantages to those two modes. And some of these issues that we see discussed around e-scooters, such as people riding on pavements and parking, when you speak to the general public, they don't necessarily make a distinction between these two types of e-scooter. They don't see if they're black or green. They see that these are e-scooters. So we wanted to understand kind of the whole of this and see how they link together. And I think the other thing to say is that when we speak to people, what we find is we're learning about the transport system as a whole. When people tell us they use an e-scooter for a certain reason, it's often telling us that the transport system hasn't been offering us that thing, that whatever that advantage is so far. And so we're really interested to see how e-scooters fit into that kind of mobility mix. And I think, therefore we're looking at these different modes, these new sort of individual electric modes, but we're also looking, and when we speak to people about e-scooters, we're also looking at shared transport, and we're learning a lot about different shared transport, and that would include bike share. We're learning about what people want from a shared transport system. So let's look at why it is that people were using e-scooters and how they find the experience. So we did a set of interviews, and we worked with a cartoonist to bring the quotes from the interviews to life. So they're not kind of specific things, they're not specific places or occurrences, they're kind of artists' impressions in a way of the issues people told us about. So this person talks about the fun element, that they really enjoy using e-scooters. And I think early on in the project, this was sort of quite dominant because of the kind of situation where mobility was something people did a lot of the time for fun. It wasn't, people weren't going to work or to the shops in the same way that they would have been before, or for education. And I think this has continued to be a theme. But what we've seen is people using e-scooters because they're enjoyable as part of a transport journey, but it doesn't mean they're using them just for fun. I think we really want to make that distinction. People are telling us about, for want of a better word, serious journeys that when they're making, and we're documenting these in the report. But that part of that decision-making process is that they want those journeys to be enjoyable. And what I like about this quote is they say at the bottom, it's the same when I cycle to work. It's the same feeling, really. So they're making that connection of that they're thinking about fun and enjoyment when they're choosing how they travel. And it makes that connection then, therefore, with cycling as kind of being in the fresh air. There's also the novelty, and that's something that's there at the moment, and in the next few years, I guess we'll see whether novelty continues to be a factor or people get more used to these. But this person also mentions, you'll see, he mentions being at work in a sweaty state, and e-scooter is something where you don't do that because it's not exercise in the same way as cycling. So that was an advantage for them. You get to kind of speed through the traffic, but you're not becoming really sweaty. For this person, they talked about going to swim at Salford Quays, just near here, and then having the flexibility to walk home with their friend and be able to pick up an e-scooter almost sort of, spontaneously if that opportunity arises. So this is really an example of that the shared aspect of this. It's what the e-scooter is giving them is the opportunity to pick up a mode of transport and use it to get home. So it's very much about the shared transport. There was a couple of really interesting issues that came through the interviews, and one is this example of a person with chronic fatigue syndrome who talks about being able to access the university campus more often as a result of having the e-scooters, because they'd either walk, which would cost energy, or they'd take an Uber, which would be expensive. So e-scooters offer them this option to actually access the campus more often, which I think is quite an interesting example when we're considering about potential social inclusion in the transport system. And secondly, this example of, in this case, a female respondent telling us that they felt safer if they were travelling fast through a space on an e-scooter, particularly at night, as opposed to walking. So the e-scooters, by combination of being a shared mode and also a fast mode, help them feel safer in terms of personal safety. However, some people then commented that they might not feel safe on the road when doing it, so they kind of weighed up that kind of personal safety versus road safety. People also mentioned waiting at public transport stops and interchanges as well as another example where they might feel unsafe. That another aspect of the transport system, such as a shared e-scooter, would help them, avoid that or contain that risk. So there's some nice cartoons to get us going. I want to show some charts now because I want to kind of draw on the statistics from the survey that we did. And this one I'll start with. These categories are user, decider, and avoider. So in this case, a user is someone who's used an e-scooter, one of the Lime e-scooters that is. A decider is someone who hasn't used an e-scooter but says they're likely to in the survey. And an avoider is someone who hasn't used one and says they're unlikely to. So it kind of gives an indication of people's likeliness of using an e-scooter in the future. And what you can see from this very clearly, as you see the age groups go up from the bottom to the top, is that it's much more the case that younger people are using the e-scooters and are more likely to use the e-scooters, are warmer to them. And we ask various questions around things like, do you agree with the statement, e-scooters are for me, that kind of thing. And it generally is, it's a sort of that younger age, those younger age groups that tend to see themselves using them. Why that might be, we'll explore shortly. Then if we look at gender, again, splitting by male and female, we can see that males are more likely to use them and less likely to say they wouldn't see themselves using them. So there's and anyone involved with cycling or walking research will know that this is fairly familiar, this kind of gender divide. And it may be it may seem a kind of simplistic or crude way of splitting the data, but there's quite a strong literature that shows that transport experiences and decisions are quite gendered, and that if you don't take these things into account, what you actually do is design a transport system for relatively confident, active young men. So it is really important to take this into account. We also looked at household income and actually found that some of the lower income groups were using e-scooters more, and that actually doesn't really correspond with other research that we've seen. So it's interesting to see why this might be the case. And it may be to do with vehicle access, which I'll come back to. So we wanted to understand better why these differences might be the case. And one issue that came out strongly through the survey and through the interviews is confidence. And if you look on the left here, you can see the general sample, 1,500 people. Around a third were confident to ride on the roads on an e-scooter. And if you split that by male and female, you can see that males were much more likely to say they were confident riding on the roads and confident on road cycle lanes. So there is quite a distinction there. We can also, I realise this is not that easy to read, but you can see across the horizontal, the age groups going up there, and then the types of road or infrastructure going down, the vertical. You can see younger people are more likely to be confident riding on the pavements and the roads. So some of this relationship between age and gender is explained by confidence, as we would expect to be the case with cycling research. So there's a kind of parallel here. If we then look at our groups of user, decider, and avoider, our user group were more people in the user group were people who were confident to ride on the roads, and it's quite a clear tail off when you look down then from deciders to avoiders, which does suggest that confidence was really important in differentiating the people who were using e-scooters to those who weren't, or even those who saw themselves using e-scooters. And this quote and this cartoon kind of illustrates that concern and maybe the strength of feeling around this, and that it's the survey respondent is concerned about the safety of the roads, and they said that's the reason they don't cycle anymore. And it seems in Greater Manchester have been getting better. There's a lot of investment going into the B network and so on, but it's still the case that people are concerned about safety on the road, and that this translates and corresponds to cycling and to e-scooter use. So when we looked at barriers, then we asked people what factors are likely to limit your e-scooter use, whether it's shared or private. We didn't make a distinction on this one. And again, we can see road safety is really important, and that it's a gender split here, that females are more likely to say that road safety issues are likely to deter them from using an e-scooter. We also ask questions, and so also there's you'll see there's for routes, i.e. not knowing which routes to take, and knowledge how to use an e-scooter. There are also things that female respondents were more likely to say were an issue. We also asked in a separate question about concerns about using a Lime e-scooter or a shared scheme in general. One of the prominent barriers was battery anxiety, so the fear that the battery would run out during the journey. And that was also something that was quite gendered, that female respondents were more likely to be concerned about that, which makes some sense. So if you were concerned about personal safety, you would be concerned about a battery running out somewhere. So, these are all things that we can take account of when thinking about how best to provide transport and give some indication of what people might be looking for in a shared transport system. So I want to talk a bit about how people connected with other modes of transport when using e-scooters. And one of the things we found, I mentioned that the connection with income might relate to transport access. And this is the chart that really shows that if you cycle and drive, you're less likely to use an e-scooter in this scheme than if you don't cycle or drive, basically. So that may not be good news if we wanted to say that e-scooters are promoting modal shift away from cars, but it does imply there may be some social inclusion benefit here. So so we looked at what connections people were making with modes of transport, and in particular what modes of transport they were replacing. So we asked people, what modes of transport have you replaced at least once with an e-scooter? And there's been, I know there's been some concern that these might be just replacing walking journeys, and then questioning the kind of public health and environmental implications of that. And it's true, they are replacing some walking journeys. You can see that they're around half, the third row, around half have replaced some kind of walking and cycling, but 2/3 have replaced a journey other than walking. And a quarter have replaced the journey by private car. And if you combine private car with taxis and ride hailing, i.e. Uber, in the bottom row there, we see around half have replaced some kind of car journey, which I think is really encouraging. If we are looking at that kind of modal shift. And when we look at some of the quotes in a moment, the interview quotes around that, I think it shows why that might be the case. So this interviewee, this interviewee did get Ubers before e-scooters, but found that e-scooters were a kind of cheaper option that they had more control over, including how long the journey would take, which is why they shifted from Ubers to e-scooters. They also, at the second paragraph there, they mention the kind of enjoyment of the journey a bit, and also an interesting point about, like, if you're in a car, you might be trapped with someone trying to tell you all about their life, whereas in an e-scooter, you're not. So there's an unexpected advantage. This person then was kind of using e-scooters when buses weren't available, so we were doing shift work, and they were buses weren't available at that time, and the e-scooters were. So this was an option for them, and it was they felt it was a better option than an Uber. This person found that they had some unreliability with their journey, and an e-scooter became something that they could use to get to work if the train connection kind of failed for them. They also mentioned then it was like a nice thing. It was it's a nice end to their journey. So there's some examples there really. What I wanted to do is kind of just give some examples of how people are building e-scooters into their journeys. So go beyond sort of looking at them in isolation, but also sort of look at them as part of people's everyday transport practices. So the final issue I want to look at then is kind of shared space, and this is something that's been in the media quite a lot, and I know there's concern about. And this quote in this cartoon kind of just illustrates some of the strength of feeling around this that people are quite concerned about. And we spoke to people, and we received survey responses from people who had felt in some way unsafe when sharing space with an e-scooter. Maybe they felt they had a potential collision, or someone came too close for them, or they didn't hear them coming. Those sort of issues. And kind of parallel to that is a kind of parking issues of where you put the e-scooters, where the parking spaces are for a start, but also where people then park or leave them if they want to. And I know that the providers make all sorts of efforts to try and contain the parking, but there are people tell us that they've seen them in the way, and all those sort of issues that you hear about. And we did a question around this because we wanted to see what the kind of the level of concern was, and from this chart then, around 60%, let's say, you can see at the bottom row, had some sort of incident where they'd sort of felt unsafe around an e-scooter, or they maybe felt they were going to trip over something. So there is a level of concern about this. And I think we have to take this very seriously. And it's, as I said, it's one of those challenges about planning transport. Really, is where do we put stuff? How do people share space? Where do we park cars? Where do we park e-scooters? Where do we park bike share? These are all really important questions. Without wanting to diminish this, I think this is really important. You can see that sort of 1% suffered an injury relating to an e-scooter. So, I mean, if we can take sort of heart from this at all, it's that there's at least a relatively low level of reported injury, and I know from the council and from Lyme that that's the case. There's been a low number of actual reported instances, but this chart kind of just shows that level of concern. And I think this is concerning primarily for two reasons. One, if there are instances that are out there that are unreported, but also if people just feel that the kind of pavements are less safe now, or shared space are less safe because there are e-scooters around, and we just need to work out how best to manage that. And I have to say that I feel unsafe when the cars on the pavement as well. I mean, it's a challenge, the shared space issue. So to finish off, we did a kind of a question just to ask people in overall, how do you see the kind of future of this? And there was actually quite a reasonable support for people agreeing with the statement. There should be an e-scooter rental trial operating in Greater Manchester. The people are more likely to agree with younger people and existing users. And I guess existing users, that's not surprising, but at least it does show that they've probably had a positive experience using e-scooters, because they think there should be more of it, or at least it should continue. And then whether e-scooters make Manchester a more attractive place to live, slightly less agreement, but still broad agreement with it. More likely to agree with males, younger people, as we saw from the stats earlier, and existing users. So to wrap up, so we've seen that the trial has kind of over time become more established and grown, and also we've had a kind of update in the Lyme vehicles as well, which I'm sure Lyme will talk about. So we've seen people gradually get used to them being here and build them into their transport practices. And I think now we're at a stage where it's really interesting. So we're saying, right, people are using these, they're using them for serious transport. So how do we now best, fit them into our transport system? We've seen people using them for fun, because they enjoy them being part of their journey, but also because they give them speed. And we didn't really talk about cost much, but that was also something that, I haven't talked about cost much here, but that was also something people talked to us about, particularly in comparison with Ubers and public transport. And this kind of flexibility then. So I think those first two there were kind of about e-scooters and that speed and the low exertion, whereas this one is more about the flexibility they offer of the shared. That could be, in a way, could be any shared transport system. It'd be able to pick up a vehicle and take it a short journey. Although there may be something about the e-scooter that guy really appreciates there. And then we've seen these kind of broader sort of slightly less tangible, but could be very valuable kind of social inclusion aspects of helping with personal safety issues, which may reflect the shared aspect or the kind of speed of the e-scooter. And then also with people who might have to manage their energy levels, or who have an injury or mobility impairment that means that cycling and walking is not for them, or at least they have to limit how much they do that. And then we've seen people integrating them with other modes of transport, which is really interesting and has I think grown as the geofence has expanded. I should know, I didn't mention that one of the sort of barriers to use was the geofence actually not going into Manchester. So it meant that people couldn't connect with something like Manchester Victoria or Manchester Piccadilly because the boundary is Salford. And that's really a nature of the trials, because it's in the Salford area. And that's something that maybe a future scheme could try to connect with the wider area. But then, I don't want to discount these experiences at all. I think there is this real challenge of sharing space. There's clear advantages that people are finding in these scooters, but there's this challenge of sharing space, and I think this needs more investigation and some, that's where that strong policy needs to come from, that says this is how we're going to, allocate space to e-scooters and micromobilities, and this is how we're going to make sure that people use them responsibly, and that seems to be one of the kind of the big questions really of how we maximise the use of these vehicles whilst also kind of minimising that wider social impact that may be happening. So I'll stop there. That was a fairly quick look through the research we've done. There's more detail in the report, and by the way, the reports are coming, and I think they're going to be brought in when the courier arrives, so you can have a copy of the report. So fingers crossed for that. But they're obviously online. So I'll stop there. We're going to have questions, so please be thinking of questions, and I'm going to hand over to Hal now from Lyme to talk about their own research.